The river had taken the bridge the night before, snapped it clean from its moorings, and sent it splintering down the gorge, thick planks thrashing like wounded things in the current. Rain had fallen in sheets for 3 days straight, soaking into the bones of the land until the hills ran like open wounds. By dawn, the valley was a grave of drowned fences and lost cattle. He stood at the edge of the river with his hat pulled low, coat soaked through, boots sunk ankle-deep in the churned mud. Across the swollen banks, the mountain road wound upward, but it may as well have been a continent away. Behind him, a wagon lay on its side, wheels half buried, the mule dead or near to it. She stood beside the wreck, her skirt soaked to her thighs, eyes trained not on the water but on him. Her name was Claire, though she hadn't said it yet. He'd learned it from a letter she dropped that first day, folded and refolded so many times the edges had begun to disintegrate. He didn't ask questions. She didn't offer answers. Not when he found her walking barefoot along the ridgeline road 2 mornings ago, dress torn at the hem, carrying nothing but a carpet-bag in silence. Not when he gave her half his canteen and the last of his dried meat. Not when she climbed into his wagon without a word and curled herself around her bag like a creature long hunted. Now the storm had made them still again. He studied the water's drag, the pull of it relentless. Downriver, the current split where a fallen pine had lodged against a rock outcropping. It frothed and coiled around it, green and furious. "We can't stay here," she said, finally. Her voice startled him more than the storm had. It was low, raspy from days without use, but steady. "I'll carry you," he said. It wasn't gallantry. There was no other way. The water would take her legs out from under her if she tried. She looked at him with something between doubt and resignation, and then nodded once. He crouched low and motioned her forward. She stepped into his arms like stepping off a ledge, without hesitation, without looking down. The river was colder than he'd guessed. It clawed at his knees, then his thighs, then his chest. He leaned into it, each step a fight, each breath timed between waves. She wrapped her arms around his neck, light and rigid. "Don't look at the far bank," he said. "Just stay with me." She didn't speak, but her grip tightened, not out of fear but something steadier. Trust, maybe, or refusal to drown. He was taller than her by a head and a half, rangy in the way of men who spent more time with animals than people, and his strength was the quiet kind, not in display but in endurance. By the time they reached the far side, he was shaking from cold and strain, but he didn't put her down. Not when they reached the trees. Not when the mud gave way to gravel, and gravel to grass. Not when she said, "You can let me go now." He only nodded once and carried her farther. Later, they'd find a half-collapsed hunting shack in the lee of the hill. He'd build a fire while she stripped out of her wet things behind a nailed-up blanket. They wouldn't speak of what came before, not yet. She would watch him from her corner, wrapped in his spare shirt, eyes wary but warmer. And he would sit by the door, knife in hand, as if guarding not just her but something invisible between them. The storm would pass by morning. But he would not quite put her down. Not ever, really. He just learned to carry her in different ways. By the time the sun returned, it came in cold, clean shafts between the trees, the forest steaming like breath after weeping. He rose before she did, stepping out into the brittle dawn, boots silent on the moss and pine needles. The world looked emptied out. The river had taken what it pleased and left the rest bruised and quiet. He found a squirrel half-drowned in a snare someone else must have set weeks before. He buried it. Then he walked farther and shot a rabbit clean through the eye. When he came back, she was stoking the fire with a bent length of metal, hair still damp and tangled from the rain, sleeves rolled high. She hadn't put her dress back on, only his shirt, cinched at the waist with a torn piece of her own petticoat. He didn't look too long. She didn't look away. They ate in silence, not companionable yet, but necessary. He spoke first. "You headed to Telluride?" "No," she kept her eyes on the fire. "North, as far as the road takes me." "Past the pass?" She nodded, "If it gets me clear." He didn't ask what from. The marks on her forearms said enough, not scars, not quite. More like remnants of hands too rough, held too long. He studied the firelight on her cheek. "It's another 2 days to the mining road. I'll take you." "I don't need you to." He shrugged. "You don't. Then he looked up, met her gaze. "But I'm going anyway." She didn't smile, but something unlatched in her shoulders. They left the cabin before noon. She walked now careful steps over the broken terrain. He kept beside her without crowding. They moved like two shadows from different storms. That night they made camp under a knotted pine. He let her sleep closest to the fire. She didn't ask if he would stand watch. She didn't need to, he already was. The days passed like old songs, slow, half-remembered, but familiar. He taught her how to move quieter through the underbrush. She taught him how to twist wild yarrow into cord. They spoke in short, sure phrases, trading knowledge like tools. She never cried, but sometimes, in the moments before dawn, she would sit upright and stare into the trees as if expecting someone, or something, he never asked who. On the fourth morning, they found the tracks. Boot prints, 3 men, heavy, fresh. He crouched beside them, fingers brushing the impressions. She stood stiff behind him. "They're close," he said. She didn't move. He stood and looked at her. "You know them." Her jaw twitched. "I know what they'll do if they catch up." He nodded once, slow. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out a revolver, and held it out to her grip first. She hesitated only a second, then she took it. That night they didn't make a fire. They camped in a shallow hollow under a fallen cedar, branches pulled down to shield them from view. He lay beside her, not touching, but near enough to feel her breath slow. She kept the revolver cradled to her chest. He watched the tree line until his eyes burned, until the silence of the woods began to pulse with the sound of his own heartbeat. And still, he never quite put her down. Even now, he carried her, in the bend of his back, in the grip on his knife, in the way his ears tuned to every rustle that wasn't wind. Because danger, like memory, traveled with them. And something inside him had already made its choice. Snow came sooner than it should have. A thin white veil swept down from the ridges in the middle of the night. It dusted the hollow where they'd hidden and turned the world quiet as a chapel. The kind of quiet that pressed against the skin, cold and reverent. By morning, their tracks had vanished. So had the men's. She was the first to rise, crouching by the edge of the hollow, with the revolver tucked into the waist of her skirt. Her breath fogged the air in front of her, but her eyes were clear. He watched her from where he lay, still and quiet, as if afraid the spell might break. The way she moved now, measured, ready, she was not the same woman he'd carried from the riverbank. And still, he watched her the way a man might watch the last light on the horizon, not wanting to believe how fast it fades. They moved north by instinct, following deer trails and half-buried creek beds. She took lead sometimes, when the slope narrowed or the sun hit a certain angle, like she once known these woods in another life. He let her. They didn't speak much now, not because there was nothing to say, but because their bodies had learned each other's rhythms, how to signal with a glance, how to move in step without wasting breath. Once in a thicket of fir, they found the remains of an old fire. Charred wood, still warm, someone had left not long before. She crouched and touched the ash with 2 fingers, then looked to him. He nodded. "They're hunting us slow. Don't want to spook you into running too far." "They won't stop," she said. "No," he agreed, "but neither will we." They climbed into thinner air by dusk, the trees sparser, the wind sharper. At a plateau above the timberline, they paused to rest. She sat on a flat stone, knees pulled to her chest, and he stood at the edge, scanning the land below. "Why are you still here?" she asked. He didn't turn. "You need someone to watch your back." "I could have left in the night." "I know." Silence drew out long between them. Then she said, softer, "You don't owe me anything." He turned then, looked at her, truly looked. Her face was thinner now, but steadier, carved into something unyielding by frost and fear. "I know," he said again. And it was the truth. He didn't owe her anything. But he still carried her, in the way he slept light and faced the wind, in the way he walked slightly ahead now, shielding her from sightlines, in the way his body had begun to measure safety in her breaths, her steps, the tilt of her head as she listened for danger. That night they found an old trapper outpost, barely standing, tucked in the crook of the mountain like a secret. The roof leaked, the floor sagged, but the stove still worked and the door still latched. She pressed her back to the wall once they were inside, exhaled slow, then slid down into a crouch. He moved to the window, keeping watch. "Will you ever ask?" she said, not looking at him. He didn't pretend not to understand. "When you're ready," he said. A log cracked in the stove, sudden and loud. She flinched, but only slightly. Then she looked up at him. "I was sold," she said, voice flat. "Even. Not in the way folks pretend not to see. In the real way, coins in a palm, a contract signed." He didn't move, didn't speak. "I ran the first time, got dragged back. Second time I killed one of 'em." She touched the revolver now, "and I kept running." Wind keened against the walls, but inside it was still. He nodded slow, "Then we keep running." "No," she stood now, crossed the room. "We start turning." And he understood. She wasn't prey anymore. Neither of them were. That night he taught her to clean the rifle, and in the morning they followed the tracks instead of hiding from them. Still side by side. Still quiet. Still carrying something between them, not burden but bond. Something heavier than fear. Something that would not let them put each other down. The tracks led down into a gully where the snow hadn't reached, just bare earth and broken leaves, trampled under boots too wide for good sense. She studied them like scripture, one hand resting lightly on her thigh, just above the revolver's worn grip. He let her lead. The men were careless, maybe tired, maybe too sure. She pointed to where one had slipped on a wet rock, and another had spat a line of tobacco juice near a fire pit of damp wood. 2 days ahead, she said, maybe less. He didn't ask how she knew. He just nodded and tightened the strap across his shoulder, the rifle snug against his back. The valley opened into a stretch of low hills dotted with pine. A creek cut through the middle, winding shallow and fast, not like the river they'd crossed, but speaking its own language, a colder one. They crossed without pause. On the other side they found signs of recent camp, feathers from a plucked bird, boot scrapes in the frost, the faint smell of grease and powder. He crouched low and touched the edge of the fire circle, still warm beneath the top layer. She stood near a tree, eyes narrowed toward the west. "They're circling," she said, "trying to draw us out." "Let's not disappoint them," he answered. They laid their trap before nightfall, moved quiet through the timberline, left false tracks in both directions, and found a hollow beneath a cluster of wind-warped spruces. He dug in behind a log, she climbed into a tree with the rifle, and they waited. The sky darkened slow, clouds slipping across the moon like tired hands. Time stretched, an owl called once sharp and sudden, then silence again. She saw the first shape break the trees, a man with a shotgun slung across his chest, moving like he knew how to kill but hadn't in a while. She didn't fire, not yet. Another followed, then the third. They moved together, too close for caution. She didn't breathe. He stayed below, eyes on the clearing, hands steady on the knife he'd sunk into the log beside him. Then a branch snapped, one of them cursed loud. And that was enough. She squeezed the trigger once, clean, practiced, and the first man dropped like stone. The other two scattered, but too slow, too loud. One veered toward the log and met the glint of steel, and the other turned back toward the trees only to find her already on the ground, rifle steady against her shoulder. It ended in 3 breaths, maybe 4. When it was done, she stood very still, her hands trembling only slightly as she lowered the rifle. He walked to her slow, she didn't look up. He reached out and without speaking, brushed the hair from her face where it had stuck to her cheek. Her eyes met his. "I thought I'd feel something," she said. "You do," he said, "but not yet." They buried the bodies come morning, not out of mercy, but because leaving them would call more trouble. She carved no names, only notches on bark. Later they sat beside the creek, boots off, their feet in the cold water. She leaned back on her hands, face to the sun. "I don't know where I'm going now," she said. "You don't have to," he said. "Not today." She looked at him, really looked. "I still feel like I'm running." He nodded, "So do I." But neither of them moved. And that was something. That night she slept closer than before, not touching, but near enough that the warmth of her back reached him through the dark. And he understood something he hadn't before. It wasn't just that he carried her. She had started to carry him too. In the quiet, in the turning back, in the way she hadn't let go. The days stretched longer now, the sun slower in its descent, like even time was beginning to ease its grip. Snow no longer chased them, only the hush of pine and the faint sound of meltwater in the gullies. They didn't speak of what had happened, not of the men they buried, nor the way her hands had steadied once the first shot rang out. Some things were absorbed into the bones, not forgotten, but carried without words. They found a wide meadow between two hills where elk had bedded down in the soft moss. He showed her how to follow their trails, where to look for shed antlers, how to move when the wind shifted. She listened without asking why it mattered. Maybe she already knew. At night they built small fires, not for warmth but for anchoring. She would gather kindling while he set snares, and when the flames finally licked skyward, they would sit opposite each other, knees drawn close, food cooking between them. One night he caught her humming, just a thread of sound, barely more than a breath, but it startled him like a bird alighting after too long silent. She stopped when she saw him listening, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he handed her the last piece of dried apple from his pack. She took it with a look that held no defenses. He'd never been a man of many places, born in a sod house that collapsed the year after he was born, drifted west with nothing but a half-broken rifle and an older brother who vanished somewhere near Helena. He never built anything that lasted. But this, her presence, her trust, it felt like timber taking root. One morning, she returned from fetching water, with a smile tugging the corners of her mouth. "There's a cabin," she said, half-mile down the ridge, smoke coming from the chimney. They approached careful, rifles loose in hand. An old couple lived there, worn soft by time. Names were Ruth and Cal. She had a limp from a fall long ago, and he had a voice like gravel and maple syrup. They didn't ask questions, just offered coffee and the kind of silence that welcomed without crowding. "You two runnin' or settlin'?" Ruth asked, not unkind. Claire looked at him, then she said, "Somewhere between." They stayed 3 nights, slept in the loft under quilts that smelled of cedar and age. She helped Ruth in the garden, coaxing the first green shoots from the thawing soil. He helped Cal mend a fence the elk had ruined in early winter. It was a glimpse of stillness, not peace, not yet, but the shape of it. On the last night, Ruth pressed a parcel of dried food into Claire's hands. "You take care of each other," she said. "We are," Claire answered. Back on the trail, neither of them spoke for a while. Then he said, "We could find a place like that." She didn't answer right away, but she didn't dismiss it either. That night she reached for his hand as they lay under the stars, not in desperation, not even in need, just presence. He didn't move, didn't breathe for a moment. Then he laced his fingers through hers. She slept with her head near his shoulder, and in the dark he whispered, "You're not something I'm holding on to, you're someone I'm standing with." She didn't stir, but he felt the weight shift in her. A different kind of carrying, shared, chosen. They came to a ridge where the land opened wide and gold, grass stretching down into a basin where the hills cupped the valley like hands. A stream wound silver through it, and on the far side, a stand of cottonwoods glowed pale against the dark spine of mountains beyond. He stopped beside her, breath low, eyes searching the basin as if he could read the future in its hush. She stood still, the wind tugging at the hem of her coat, her fingers curled around the straps of the pack on her back. "This it?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes scanned the land, not for threats, but for something quieter, safety maybe, stillness, a place to set something down without it vanishing. "I think so," she said. They didn't move for a while, just stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the light stretch longer across the valley floor. They spent the next few days building what could be built with bare hands and salvaged tools. A lean-to first, then a fire pit. He felled a dead pine and stripped it clean, and she learned the rhythm of the saw, the way it caught when you leaned too hard. He taught her to notch beams, to fit them snug like puzzle pieces. She taught him how to set a snare that wouldn't spook rabbits, how to dig a garden bed shallow and wide where the soil was dark with old life. Each night they collapsed into sleep near the fire, muscles aching in new ways, but not the kind that feared pursuit. These aches belong to labor, to making something last. One afternoon, she knelt beside the stream, washing a shirt he'd torn at the shoulder. He came up behind her, set down a fish he'd caught, and crouched beside her. "House'll have a roof before first frost," he said. "Think it'll hold?" she asked, not looking up. "I think we will." She looked at him then. Her eyes still carried shadows, but they no longer chased her. They lived alongside the light now. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Used to," he ran a hand over his beard. "Now I just think about tomorrow." She nodded slow, "Me too." That night they shared the cot for the first time. No words were spoken, no declarations made. Just her back to his chest, her fingers tucked against his ribs and his arm across her, protective in a way that asked nothing. "In the dark," she said, "when you carried me across the river, I thought you'd let me go once we reached the bank." "I didn't," he said. "I know." She turned then, pressed her forehead to his, and whispered, "I don't want you to." He didn't promise anything. He didn't need to. What they had wasn't forged in words. It was in fire tended, wounds dressed, shelter raised by hand. It was in the way they walked side by side through silence, in the way he still kept watch long after she fell asleep. Autumn came slow that year. The cottonwoods turned golden and the air thinned like a held breath. He built a second chair beside the door. She planted beans. One evening they sat watching the horizon. A hawk circled above, riding the thermals. "We're not running anymore," she said. "No," he answered, "we're home." Not a place, not even the land they'd settled. But in each other. In what they chose, day after day, to stay. To carry. And to never, not quite, put each other down.